The air in the forum is thick with the shouts of merchants and the rich scent of foreign spices. Every purchase here was a battle of wits, a silent duel where a single wrong move could cost you a week's wages. By the end of this, you will possess the forgotten rulebook for Roman bargaining, the same psychological plays that determined who ate like an emperor and who was left with empty pockets. We will uncover how a simple handshake could seal a deal more binding than any contract, and why walking away was the most powerful move of all. What do you believe it took to survive a marketplace designed to outsmart you? A senator did not haggle for his wine. He would glide through the bustling forum, his toga a clear signal of his rank, and merchants would immediately present their finest amphorae. The price was almost an afterthought, a formality in a transaction built on display and patronage. For the Roman elite, shopping was less about economy and more about reinforcing their social standing. Every purchase was a public performance of their wealth and influence, but for the common plebeian, the mother of three haggling for a handful of fish, the stakes were survival itself. Her every coin was counted, her every word a strategic move to stretch her family's meager budget. The marketplace was a microcosm of Roman society, a stage where the rigid class structure played out in dramatic, everyday negotiations. A wealthy patrician could insult a merchant's prices and be laughed off as eccentric. A slave sent to market by their master had to navigate a treacherous middle ground, possessing no personal bargaining power, yet expected to return with a good deal, all while being viewed with suspicion by sellers. Even a freedman who had earned his liberty carried the invisible chains of his past, often having to prove his worth with every transaction. The etiquette was unwritten but understood by all. It dictated how you approached a stall, the tone of your voice, and even how long you were expected to bargain. To overstep was to risk public humiliation or worse, to be permanently labeled a difficult customer. So the next time you picture a Roman market, see beyond the goods and the noise. See the silent language of status being spoken with every gesture and every counter-offer. How would you, a stranger to this world, even begin to know the rules? Every transaction in that chaotic marketplace relied on one unspoken fear. Was the coin in your hand real? Into this environment of constant suspicion stepped the argentarii, the Roman bankers. Their tables were islands of calm calculation amidst the shouting and haggling. A merchant would not simply accept a handful of coins from a stranger. He would often gesture toward the nearest money changer, and the two would walk over together. The argentarius would take the proffered coins, his fingers sensitive to the slightest imperfection in the metal. He would weigh them on a tiny scale, listen for the true ring of silver against stone, and inspect the often worn imprint of the emperor's face. His word was final. A nod from him could seal a deal, while a frown could destroy a seller's trust in an instant. But their power went far beyond simple authentication. Imagine a plebeian family needing to buy an expensive item, perhaps a new piece of furniture or a large clay oven. They could not possibly carry all the heavy bronze coins required. Instead, they would go to their argentarius first. He might extend them a line of credit, a promise to pay the merchant on their behalf. This single act transformed the entire bargaining dynamic. A buyer backed by a banker's credit walked into a negotiation with immense power. They could agree to a higher price because they were not spending physical cash in that moment, and the merchant was guaranteed payment from a trusted source. This system, however, also created a new layer of tension. A seller might inflate his price if he knew the buyer was using credit, seeing an opportunity for greater profit from someone who was not counting out coins one by one. The argentarius himself could become a point of contention. His fee for the service or his unfavorable exchange rate for foreign currency often became a whispered part of the price negotiation between buyer and seller. The true cost of any large purchase was not just the price of the goods, but also the hidden cost of the financial machinery that made the transaction possible. This entire delicate dance of trust and finance could collapse in a moment. What happened when a banker's judgment was wrong, when a clever forger's work went undetected? The entire web of trust that held the market together would begin to unravel. Even the most trusted argentarius could be fooled by a clever enough fake. The coins that changed hands were not all created equal, and a wise Roman knew their currency as well as they knew their own name. The most common silver coin was the denarius, a day's pay for a legionary soldier. For smaller purchases, people used the sestertius, a brass coin worth 1/4 of a denarius, but the value was not just in the name stamped upon it. It was in the metal itself, and this is where the deception began. Unscrupulous individuals would practice coin clipping, shaving tiny, almost imperceptible slivers of silver from the edges of many coins. They would then melt these clippings down to create new illegitimate coins. Another trick was coin sweating, where a pouch full of coins would be shaken violently with other hard objects. The friction would wear off tiny particles of precious metal, which would be collected from the bottom of the pouch. Over time, a once full-weight denarius could become dangerously light. Then there were the outright forgeries, coins made of a base metal like lead or copper, and then plated with a thin veneer of silver to pass a casual inspection. So how did a savvy shopper protect themselves before a single word of haggling even began? The first test was the sound. A genuine silver denarius had a distinct, high-pitched ring when dropped on a hard stone counter. A clipped or sweated coin would sound dull, and a forgery would make a soft thudding noise. Next came the feel. A person would run their thumb over the coin's edge. A smooth, even edge was a good sign, while a rough or uneven one suggested clipping. They would also check the weight in their palm, developing an instinct for what a true denarius should feel like. Finally, they would inspect the imprint. Coins with worn-down features were not just old, they were often suspicious, as forgers struggled to replicate the sharp, detailed portraits of the emperor. A merchant, seeing a customer perform these quick practice checks, knew they were dealing with someone who could not be easily cheated. This simple, silent inspection set the stage for the entire negotiation that followed. It established a baseline of respect and caution, but what if the goods themselves were the deception? What tricks lay hidden within the amphorae of wine and the sacks of grain that filled the market stalls? That silent inspection of a coin was the buyer's first shield, but the moment it ended, the merchant launched his opening attack. He did not state a price. He declared a praeteum, an opening value designed not as a true offer, but as an anchor for the entire negotiation to come. This initial figure was a carefully crafted piece of psychological warfare, calculated to make the buyer feel they had won a great victory by haggling it down to a sum the merchant had always intended to accept. Sellers were masters of reading their clientele at a single glance. A wealthy patrician in a fine toga would be quoted 1 praeteum, a staggering sum that flattered his status and signaled the highest quality goods. A common laborer, his tunic worn and dusty, would hear a different, lower price, one that still left ample room for bargaining, but did not immediately scare him away from the stall. Scarcity was the merchant's greatest ally. A shipment of Egyptian papyrus delayed by storms, a rare spice from the east that might not arrive again for months. These factors would be woven into the seller's pitch, justifying a praeteum that was doubly or even triply inflated. He might sigh dramatically, explaining that this was the very last amphora of a particularly fine Falernian wine, a vintage the buyer would surely never find again. This created a powerful sense of urgency and exclusivity around a simple jar of wine. Perceived value was another key weapon. A merchant selling ordinary wool cloaks might drape one over a small, ornate statue, instantly making the garment seem more luxurious. He might casually mention that a similar cloak was favored by a famous gladiator, attaching a story to an otherwise common item. The praeteum for that cloak would reflect not its cost, but the legend the seller had just invented for it. This opening gambit set the entire emotional tone for the exchange. A ridiculously high praeteum could intimidate an inexperienced buyer into paying far more than they should, their confidence shattered before the real haggling even began. For a seasoned shopper, however, it was a signal. It told them the merchant was playing the game aggressively and that they would need to counter with an equally bold, perhaps even insulting, offer of their own. The entire drama of the Roman market hinged on this first, volatile number hanging in the air between two people. But how did a buyer possibly respond to such a brazen opening move without losing their composure or their money? That first outrageous price hung in the air, a deliberate test of the buyer's nerve. An unskilled customer might flinch or show a flicker of desire, but a true Roman negotiator knew the power of silence. The most effective response was not a number, but a deliberate, unhurried pause. This created a vacuum of uncertainty, forcing the merchant to wonder if his opening gambit had failed completely. Then came the contra preteum, the counteroffer, and it was an art form in itself. A buyer would never simply state a lower price. That would imply he was still engaged on the seller's terms. Instead, he might let out a soft, dismissive laugh, turning slightly away from the stall, as if the very idea of that price was an insult to his intelligence. He was feigning disinterest, signaling that he had countless other options and that this particular merchant's goods were not essential. His eyes, however, would remain active, scanning the merchandise for leverage. He might pick up the amphora of wine he supposedly did not want and point to a nearly invisible hairline crack in the clay. He would mention, almost as an afterthought, how the olive oil at the stall 3 rows over was not only clearer in color, but was being offered for a fraction of this preteum. This was not just haggling, it was a deliberate campaign to dismantle the seller's confidence and shift the entire power dynamic. By referencing a rival's price, the buyer was importing competition directly into the negotiation, reminding the merchant that he was not the only source of goods in the vast, noisy forum. Pointing out flaws, no matter how minor, was a psychological masterstroke. It reframed the perfect item the merchant was presenting into a slightly damaged one, fundamentally altering its perceived value. The entire dance was a battle over the story of the object itself. Was it a rare treasure as the seller claimed, or was it a flawed product available cheaper elsewhere, as the buyer insisted? The truth was often somewhere in the middle, but the victor would be the one who controlled that narrative. This opening counter-offer set the boundaries for the entire war of numbers to come. If the buyer's contra preteum was too high, the merchant would sense weakness and hold firm. If it was too low and delivered without the proper theatrical disinterest, it could be seen as an insult, causing the seller to refuse any further negotiation out of pride. The air would grow thick with unspoken calculations. Every sigh, every glance away, every critical tap on a piece of pottery was a move in this high-stakes game. But the drama was only beginning. The merchant never just accepted this first counteroffer. He had his own bag of tricks, a set of rehearsed performances designed to win back control and make the buyer emotionally invested in the very item he was pretending to scorn. A merchant's theatrical outrage was only half the performance. The true negotiation happened in the silent language of the body. A subtle shake of the head from a buyer, timed just as the seller named his latest price, could be more powerful than any spoken refusal. It was a clear, non-confrontational signal that the offer was unacceptable, forcing the merchant to recalibrate without either party losing face. Posture spoke volumes. A buyer who stood with his weight evenly distributed, his shoulders relaxed, projected an aura of patient confidence. He was in no hurry, and the seller knew it. Conversely, a buyer who leaned in too eagerly, his body angled intensely toward the desired object, broadcasted desperate desire. A skilled merchant would spot this instantly and hold his price firm, knowing the customer's own body had already betrayed his true intentions. Eye contact was a delicate weapon. To hold a merchant's gaze for too long could be seen as a challenge, an act of aggression that might harden his position. Yet to look away constantly suggested shiftiness or a lack of conviction. The most effective negotiators used a balanced approach, meeting the seller's eyes when making a firm counteroffer to show seriousness, then casually breaking contact to examine the goods or glance around the market, demonstrating a relaxed indifference. The hands were constantly in motion, but not without purpose. A buyer might run his fingers over the weave of a linen tunic to assess its quality, but this same gesture, if done slowly and thoughtfully, also communicated a deep consideration that flattered the merchant. Tapping a finger impatiently on the counter, however, was a clear sign of frustration, a tell that gave the seller an advantage. Then there was the most powerful gesture of all, the ultimate silent threat, walking away. This was not a frantic stomping off in anger. It was a calm, deliberate disengagement. A skilled buyer would state his final offer, and if it was refused, he would simply nod, turn, and begin to walk slowly from the stall. Every step was a calculated risk. He was betting that the merchant's desire for a sale was greater than his pride. The merchant, in turn, was watching for any hesitation, a slight slowdown in pace, a glance back over the shoulder. That single glance could undo the entire performance, revealing the buyer's bluff. But if the walkaway was executed with perfect conviction, it often triggered a call from the merchant, agreeing to the price or making a new, much lower offer. In that final silent exchange of resolve, the true price was discovered. Yet what happened when the deal was finally struck? Another set of ancient rituals began, rituals that bound the agreement in a way that felt as solid as law. That final knot of agreement was sealed with more than just a handshake. In the Roman marketplace, the sharpest negotiators knew that numbers were only half the battle. The true art lay in weaving a web of personal connection, making it emotionally costly for the other person to walk away from a deal. A shrewd merchant, noticing a customer's accent, might suddenly light up and exclaim that his own mother hailed from that very same region. He was no longer just a seller, he was a fellow countryman, creating an instant, unspoken bond that came with an expectation of fairness, or at the very least, a better price. Flattery was a currency as potent as the denarius itself. A buyer might admiringly comment on the merchant's obvious expertise, praising the exceptional quality of his wares compared to the shoddy goods found elsewhere. This compliment served a dual purpose. It put the seller in a positive, agreeable mood, and it also subtly pressured him to live up to that flattering image by offering goods of a matching standard. The most powerful tactic, however, was the appeal to family. A buyer, perhaps a young father bargaining for a winter cloak, might gesture to his children nearby. He would speak not of coins, but of necessity, of keeping his little ones warm against the coming chill. This transformed the transaction from a simple exchange of goods into a plea grounded in shared human experience. How could a merchant, himself likely a father, justify driving a hard bargain against the well-being of a family? The seller had his own version of this emotional play. He might sigh and mention that the profits from this very sale would go toward his daughter's dowry, framing the buyer's stubbornness as an obstacle to his own family's future. This created a powerful sense of obligation, making a low offer feel not just cheap but personally disrespectful. These strategies turned an anonymous market encounter into a temporary, faux familial relationship. Refusing a price now felt like betraying a newfound friend or failing a neighbor in need. The brilliant psychology at work was the creation of a debt that had nothing to do with money. By offering you kindness, flattery, or a shared story, the other person gave you a social gift, and to reject their subsequent price was to reject that gift, an act that went against the very grain of Roman social codes. This invisible pressure often loosened purse strings more effectively than any threat or logical argument ever could. It proved that in the ancient world, the most binding contracts were not written on wax tablets, but forged in the fleeting, calculated warmth of human connection. But these human connections were only one layer of the negotiation. Looming over every transaction, invisible yet ever present, were the gods themselves. A merchant, his hand resting on an amphora of wine, might not just praise its flavor, he would swear an oath by Mercury, the swift-footed god of commerce and profit, that the wine within was from the very slopes of Mount Falernus. To swear falsely was to invite divine retribution, a curse upon one's business and family. This was not merely a sales tactic, it was a powerful credibility check in a world without consumer protection agencies. A buyer hearing such an oath had to weigh the merchant's word against the fear of the god's wrath. Would a seller truly risk the anger of Mercury for a few extra coins? Some undoubtedly would, but the belief was potent enough to sway many a hesitant purchaser. On the other side of the stall, a buyer might be seen quietly touching a small figurine of Alar, a household god that he kept in a pouch. He was seeking divine favor not just for a good deal, but for protection against deception. Before even approaching a merchant, a family might make a small offering of grain or wine at a household shrine, praying to their lairs for guidance in the marketplace and the wisdom to spot a fair price. This spiritual dimension transformed haggling from a simple economic act into a test of faith and morality. A merchant known for honest oaths could build a reputation that drew loyal customers, while one suspected of perjury would find his stall increasingly empty. The most superstitious might even interpret events during the bargaining as omens. A sudden gust of wind that rattled the merchant's awning could be seen as a sign from the gods that his price was too high. The cry of a specific bird flying overhead might be taken as a divine warning to a buyer to walk away. These beliefs added a layer of unpredictable, supernatural pressure to an already tense encounter. The final agreed price was not just a number, It was a figure blessed or cursed by the unseen forces that Romans believed governed every aspect of daily life. The deal was sealed not only by a handshake, but by the silent, hopeful assumption that the gods approved, and if they did not, the consequences could extend far beyond a single bad purchase, haunting a home or a business for years to come. The most powerful move in the Roman market required a complete rejection of the merchant's reality. It was the strategic walkaway, a performance of absolute indifference that tested the very limits of a seller's desperation. The timing of this turn was everything. A buyer would state their final offer, their tone flat and resolute, leaving no room for further debate. Then, without another word, they would pivot smoothly and begin to walk. Not a hurried retreat, but a slow, deliberate stroll away from the stall, as if 100 other, better options awaited just a few steps further on. This was not an act of anger, but of cool, calculated disengagement. Every measured step was a silent question posed to the merchant. How badly do you need this sale? The buyer's posture was critical. Shoulders had to remain relaxed, head held high, with not even a hint of hesitation in their gait. The greatest risk, the fatal flaw that would destroy the entire gambit, was the glance back. A single fleeting look over the shoulder would reveal the buyer's true desire, signaling to the merchant that this was merely a bluff. The walk had to project a conviction so absolute that the merchant believed the deal was already lost. From his perspective, the merchant was rapidly calculating his own bottom line. He was weighing the vanishing customer against his profit margin, his pride, and the very real possibility that his goods might not sell at all that day. He was watching the buyers retreating back for any tell, any sign of weakness. If the buyer's walk was perfect, the merchant would often break. A call would ring out across the crowded market, a final lower offer, or an acceptance of the buyer's last price. This moment revealed the seller's true lowest acceptable price, a number he would never have volunteered willingly. For the buyer, the walkaway was the ultimate tool for price discovery, cutting through all the theatrical bluster to find the real value of the goods. But what happened when the merchant, a seasoned veteran of this psychological warfare, refused to call you back? A strategic walkaway was a public performance, but the most effective negotiations began long before a buyer ever approached a stall. Astute Romans understood that information was a currency more valuable than the denarius itself. They would arrive at the forum armed not just with coins, but with gossip, whispers, and hard-won intelligence about the merchants they intended to face. This was the ancient art of market reconnaissance. A housewife bargaining for a new cooking pot would first spend an hour simply listening. She would linger near a potter's stall, pretending to examine a vase while her ears captured every transaction. She noted the prices he accepted from other customers, learning his true bottom line without ever making an offer herself. She might overhear a merchant complaining to his neighbor about a slow morning or a recent shipment that had not sold. This single piece of information, that the seller was growing desperate, became a powerful weapon. When she finally stepped forward to bargain, she could counter his high praeteum not with an arbitrary number, but with a pointed observation. "I noticed you sold a similar pot to the woman in the blue stola for far less just moments ago," she might say calmly, or "I heard your shipment from Capua arrived with several broken items. This must be a difficult day for you." Such statements, delivered with quiet confidence, immediately dismantled the merchant's position. They proved he was not dealing with a naive shopper, but with an informed opponent who knew his vulnerabilities. The seller's inflated claims about scarcity and quality crumbled against the cold, hard reality of his own recent sales and admitted misfortunes. How could he maintain that his price was firm when the buyer had evidence to the contrary? This intelligence network extended to a merchant's reputation. A buyer might discreetly ask a trusted money changer or a vendor of a non-competing good about a particular seller's character. Was he known for honest measurements? Did he secretly mix cheap wine with the expensive vintages? A rumor of diluted wine, once introduced into the negotiation, gave the buyer immense leverage. He could demand a taste from the very amphora he was purchasing, a test he would not normally insist upon, using the shadow of doubt to justify a much lower offer. This transformed the haggling from a debate over price into an inquisition into the merchant's honesty, a far more uncomfortable position for any seller. The goal was to enter the negotiation with the upper hand, to make the merchant feel exposed and scrutinized before a single price was ever uttered. In the crowded, noisy Roman marketplace, the quietest whispers often held the power to secure the very best deals. But what happened when the bargaining was done and a price was finally agreed upon? An entirely new set of rituals began, rituals that ensured the deal would be honored long after both parties had left the forum. The final price was only the beginning of a different kind of negotiation. The rhythm and tactics of bargaining shifted completely depending on what was being sold, transforming the marketplace from a single arena into a collection of specialized psychological battlegrounds. In the crowded food quarter, the air thick with the smell of fish and fresh bread, haggling was a rapid-fire exchange driven by urgency and perishability. A merchant selling grain or vegetables had no time for long, drawn-out performances. His goods would spoil by sunset, and his goal was volume, turning over his stock as quickly as possible. A housewife would approach, her basket ready, and the bargaining was blunt and efficient. She would point out a bruise on an apple, the dust on a sack of lentils, using minor flaws to justify a lower price. The merchant, in turn, might toss an extra handful of olives into her scale to close the deal, valuing a fast sale over a slightly higher profit. This was a world of small margins and swift, almost transactional, agreements. The entire interaction might last less than a minute, a sharp contrast to the theater unfolding just a few streets away. There in the shaded stalls dealing in silk, jewelry, and exotic spices from the East, time itself was a currency. A merchant selling Egyptian papyrus or Indian pepper was not just selling an object, he was selling a story of distant lands and rare craftsmanship. He would not state a price immediately. Instead, he would invite a serious buyer to sit, perhaps offering a cup of wine. He would slowly unroll a bolt of silk, letting the client feel its impossible smoothness, all while speaking of the dangerous sea voyages and exotic caravans that brought it to Rome. The haggling here was a slow, deliberate dance of relationship building. The merchant was assessing the buyer's wealth and sophistication, while the buyer was demonstrating his knowledge and taste. A lowball offer in this context was not a strategic move, it was a social faux pas, revealing one as a crude amateur unworthy of such luxury. The price negotiated in these stalls was not just for the spice or the silk, it was for the entire experience, the promise of exclusivity, and the beginning of a patron-client relationship that might last for years. In the food market, you haggled with your coins in your hand. In the luxury market, you bargained with your entire social standing. So how did these different arenas of commerce, with their clashing rhythms and rules, manage to coexist under the same sun-baked roofs? The answer lies in the final, unbreakable rule that governed every transaction, a principle so fundamental that to violate it was to be cast out from the Roman world of trade forever. A wealthy Roman matron never dirtied her hands with the common noise of haggling. She would glide through the market, a silent slave trailing a few steps behind. With a subtle gesture, she would indicate a bolt of cloth or an amphora of wine, and the slave would step forward to do the bargaining. This was a deliberate strategy of social insulation. For the elite, direct price disputes were beneath their dignity, a messy affair that risked personal embarrassment. By using a slave as a proxy, they maintained an untouchable aura of wealth and authority, never having to personally engage in a battle of wits with a social inferior. The slave, however, was thrust into a complex and often treacherous role. He was expected to be both pitiless negotiator and invisible servant, employing aggressive tactics that would be considered vulgar if his master used them himself. He could insult the quality of the goods, dismiss the price as laughable, and even walk away from a deal multiple times, all without tarnishing his owner's reputation. The master remained aloof, a statue of impartial judgment, while the slave did the dirty work of commerce. This system gave the wealthy a distinct psychological advantage. They could authorize the most hard-nosed bargaining without ever personally experiencing the merchant's resentment or the sting of rejection. But for the slave sent to buy the household's daily bread, the stakes were entirely different. His master's purse was on the line, but his own well-being was the true collateral. Returning with a bad deal, or worse, being cheated, could mean punishment. He had to develop a sharp eye for quality and a keen sense of true value, navigating the market with a blend of subservience and shrewdness that was a daily tightrope walk. He could not afford the pride that often derailed negotiations between free men. His goal was simple: secure the best possible terms without provoking a scene that would get back to his master. In this invisible economy, The slave's success at the market was a quiet testament to his own survival skills, a small pocket of agency within a life of total control. The sun's position in the sky was a silent auctioneer, its relentless climb dictating the value of everything in the market. For the canny Roman shopper, a sundial was as crucial a tool as a money pouch. A merchant selling fresh-caught fish at dawn could command a premium price, his goods gleaming and firm. By the 10th hour, with the afternoon heat settling in, that same merchant grew desperate. The gleam had faded from the mackerel's skin, and a faint, telltale scent began to rise from his stall. This was the moment for a bold buyer to strike, offering a fraction of the morning's price for what was essentially the same fish, betting that a low profit was better than a total loss for the seller. The rhythm of decay created a powerful, time-sensitive advantage for those willing to wait. This principle of timing extended far beyond the daily catch. The entire Roman economy pulsed with the seasons, and the shrewdest households planned their major purchases like military campaigns. Just after the autumn harvest, when thousands of new amphorae of olive oil were pressed and brought to market, the sheer abundance of supply made prices plummet. A family seeking to stock their larder for the year would buy their annual supply of oil then, capitalizing on a buyer's market. Conversely, trying to purchase a thick wool cloak in the depths of January was a fool's errand. The merchant, knowing his customers were shivering, held all the power, and his praetorium would reflect their desperation. Savvy shoppers even orchestrated the sequence of their market visits with tactical precision. They would never buy heavy, bulky goods like grain or pottery first. To do so would weigh themselves down both physically and psychologically. A buyer struggling under the burden of a sack of wheat was a tired, impatient buyer, one far more likely to accept a higher price on subsequent items just to end the ordeal. Instead, they would move through the market from least essential to most, securing small, lightweight purchases first and saving the difficult, heavy negotiations for last, when their hands were still free and their resolve was still strong. This intricate dance with the clock and the calendar meant that in ancient Rome, the true price of an item was never fixed. It was a number forever in motion, shaped by the shadows cast by the sun and the turning of the seasons. A single household could only haggle for so much, but an entire neighborhood held the power to reshape a merchant's entire day. This was the ancient principle of collective bargaining, where ordinary Romans discovered that unity was a force more powerful than the sharpest wit. Neighbors, or sometimes an entire extended family living in the same insular apartment block, would pool their resources and their shopping lists. Instead of one woman buying a single amphora of olive oil, 10 families would combine their orders into a single, massive purchase of 10 amphorae. They would then appoint one of their most persuasive members to negotiate on behalf of the group. This representative would approach the merchant not as a humble shopper, but as the agent of a major client. The opening line of the negotiation changed completely. It was no longer, "What is your price for this oil?" It became, "We are prepared to purchase your entire stock of oil at once, but only at a price of 20% below your usual rate." For the merchant, this was an offer fraught with both temptation and peril. The sheer volume of the sale guaranteed him a significant profit in one swift transaction, clearing his shelves and saving him hours of tedious, individual haggling. It was a guaranteed payday, yet accepting such a deep discount meant sacrificing the higher profits he might have eked out from wealthier, individual customers. He had to weigh the certainty of a bulk sale against the possibility of a more lucrative, but far less certain, series of smaller ones. The psychological pressure was immense. Refusing the group's offer could mean watching them take their collective business to his rival just a few stalls down, a devastating blow to his prestige and his purse. The group's negotiator, armed with the weight of a communal purse, could employ tactics no individual ever could. He could calmly state that his people would simply move on to the next seller, and the merchant knew this was not an empty threat. The power dynamic had been utterly inverted. This practice reveals a sophisticated understanding of market forces that feels remarkably modern. It was the birth of the buying cooperative, a strategic alliance of consumers who understood that their combined demand gave them the leverage to dictate terms. How many other secrets of collective power have been lost to time, waiting to be rediscovered in the dust of the forum? Even the sharpest haggler knew when to sheath his wit. For all its competitive spirit, the Roman marketplace operated within a strict, unwritten code of honor. and violating this code could damage a person's reputation far more than any bad deal. Haggling was not a free-for-all, it was a social contract. Certain transactions were considered sacred, and to question the price was to insult the very foundation of the relationship. The most obvious was the bond with a trusted vendor, a family that had bought its bread from the same baker for years, or its wine from the same merchant, did not haggle. The price was understood to be fair, a reflection of long-standing loyalty and mutual respect. To suddenly challenge that price was an act of profound disrespect, suggesting you no longer trusted the person who had reliably fed your household for a decade. It was a quick way to find yourself without a reliable supplier. Religious festivals and public holidays presented another boundary. During the Saturnalia, for instance, social norms were turned upside down, but commercial ones were often solidified in generosity. Pressing a merchant for a better price during a sacred time was seen as miserly, a focus on base commerce when the community was meant to be celebrating together. It marked a person as someone who did not understand the higher values of Roman life. Then there were the goods with a so-called just price, a concept debated by philosophers and understood by common people. Basic essential foodstuffs like grain, especially the subsidized grain dole, had a fixed, publicly acknowledged value. Attempting to haggle over the price of bread was not just futile, it was shameful, an admission that you were trying to cheat the system that fed the city's poor. It was akin to arguing over the cost of a ticket to the public baths. The price was what it was. Even in the private market, some items carried a moral weight that made haggling seem crass. A funeral shroud, for example, or an offering for a temple. To bargain aggressively over the cloth that would wrap a loved one for eternity was to reveal a soul devoid of piety, placing money above duty and respect. The true master of the market understood that his skill was not just in driving a hard bargain, but in knowing precisely when to open his purse without a single word of dispute. This delicate balance between shrewdness and honor defined a person's character in the eyes of their peers. So where did a Roman turn when this entire system of trust and honor broke down, when a deal went sour and a merchant's oath proved to be a lie? For every clever tactic a buyer perfected, the merchants had a countermeasure waiting. While a customer was busy inspecting coins and feigning disinterest, the seller was orchestrating a subtle psychological play of his own. One of his most effective defenses was the art of bundling. A potter, for instance, would not just sell you a single cooking pot, he would have it displayed as part of a set, nestled beside a matching lid and a small serving dish. When you asked for the price of the pot alone, he might sigh and explain that it was only sold as a complete set, a package deal from his workshop. The price for the bundle was always a compelling value, just low enough to make buying the individual item you actually wanted seem foolishly expensive. You came for a pot, but you left carrying 3 pieces, convinced you had outsmarted him by getting so much for your money, when in reality he had moved slower selling inventory by attaching it to a popular item. Then there was the power of the free gift. A wine merchant, locked in a stalemate with a stubborn buyer over the price of an amphora, might suddenly smile and clap the man on the shoulder. "My friend, you drive a hard bargain," he would say. "For you, and only because I like your spirit, I will include this fine drinking cup at no extra charge." The cup was, of course, a cheap, mass-produced item of negligible cost to him, but its perceived value in the moment was immense. This gesture of apparent generosity created a powerful sense of reciprocity. How could the buyer continue to argue over a few extra sestertii? After receiving such a personal gift, the social debt felt heavier than the financial one, and the deal was often sealed at the merchant's preferred price. More deceptive still was the use of decoy products. A textile seller would drape 3 cloaks side by side. On the left, a coarse, poorly dyed cloak at a low price. On the right, an impossibly luxurious, silk-trimmed one at an astronomical sum. And in the center, the cloak he truly wanted to sell, priced just slightly higher than the cheap one. The buyer, comparing all 3, would instinctively see the middle option as the smart choice, the perfect balance of quality and value. They never realized the merchant had placed the cheap cloak there solely to make the target item seem like a steal, a tactic that manipulated their perception of value before a single word was spoken. But the most audacious strategy involved a hidden cast of characters. A shill, a confederate of the merchant, would wander the market and pause at the desired stall. In a voice loud enough for nearby shoppers to hear, He would effusively praise the quality of the wool or the rarity of the spices. He might even engage in a quick fake negotiation, agreeing to a high price and walking away with a purchase, creating an illusion of high demand and justifying the merchant's steep premium to every real customer who followed. These were not mere tricks, they were a sophisticated understanding of human psychology, turning the buyer's own desires and social instincts against them in a silent, masterful defense of the merchant's profit. A merchant's oath was only as trustworthy as the scale he used to weigh your purchase. The physical tools of the trade were a world of deception all their own, a silent conspiracy of lead and wood designed to lighten your purse. A seller of grain or olives might use a scale with one arm slightly shorter than the other, a flaw invisible to the untrained eye, but enough to consistently deliver less than what was paid for. Measuring vessels were another common trick. A clay modius, the standard unit for dry goods, could have a discreetly thickened bottom or a false inner layer, reducing its true capacity while appearing perfectly standard from the outside. A buyer would watch the merchant pour a full measure of wheat into a sack, never suspecting the container itself was a liar. The units of measurement themselves were a weapon of confusion. A merchant might quote a price per libra, a Roman pound, but then use a local, unofficial weight that was significantly lighter than the official standard kept in the forum. For a shopper unfamiliar with the nuances, it was like trying to haggle in a foreign language where the meanings of the words kept changing. So how did a savvy Roman protect themselves from this physical fraud? The most direct method was to insist on using their own personal set of bronze weights and a folding scale. Producing these from a pouch was a powerful, non-verbal challenge to the merchant's integrity. It stated clearly and without accusation that his tools were not to be trusted. The negotiation would then proceed with the buyer's own certified measures as the final arbiter, completely neutralizing this form of deception. For larger purchases or in disputes, both parties could demand a trip to the public standard. Official weights and measures, often made of stone or bronze, were kept in a public space, sometimes near the Temple of Mercury. A merchant caught using false measures there faced not just a lost sale, but public shaming, a fine, or even a ban from the market. This threat of exposure was a powerful deterrent. A buyer might also use simple, clever tests. Before the grain was poured, they would run their fingers along the inner rim of the merchant's modius, feeling for any suspicious ridges or a bottom that seemed too high. They would watch the scales balance with a critical eye, ensuring the pointer rested truly in the center before the goods were added. This constant, quiet vigilance was the price of fairness in a marketplace where every piece of equipment could be engineered to steal. The true price of anything was not just the number of coins exchanged, but the constant, wearying effort required to ensure you were not being cheated at the most fundamental level. The market was a stage, and every successful haggler had their lines memorized. A buyer would approach a stall not with a demand, but with a carefully crafted plea. He might open his hands in a gesture of emptiness and sigh, "I am but a poor citizen, my friend." This was not a statement of fact, but a rhetorical opening move. It set a tone of shared struggle, inviting the merchant to empathize rather than compete. The buyer was framing himself not as an adversary, but as a fellow Roman trying to get by, making an aggressive counteroffer seem like a personal attack on his well-being. The merchant's response was an equally polished performance of despair. Upon hearing a low offer, he would often clutch his chest or cast his eyes to the heavens, exclaiming, "That price will ruin me. I have a family to feed." This was not a literal fear of bankruptcy, but a theatrical rebuttal designed to mirror the buyer's own emotional appeal. He was saying, "Your struggle is not unique, and your offer threatens my own survival." The goal was to make the buyer feel guilty for driving such a hard bargain, shifting the focus from the value of the goods to the moral weight of the transaction. Another common buyer's tactic was the appeal to future business. A customer might say, "Sell it to me for this price, and I will tell all my friends about your fine stall." This transformed a simple purchase into an investment in the merchant's reputation, a promise of free advertising that held immense value in a crowded marketplace. The seller in turn had a script for flattery. He might lean in conspiratorially and say, "For a man of your obvious discernment, I can offer a special price." This line did two things at once. It complimented the buyer's taste, making him feel smart and valued, and it created an illusion of exclusivity. as if this particular deal was a privilege reserved only for the most sophisticated customers. The entire exchange was a duel of performed identities. The buyer played the humble plebeian or the influential patron. The seller played the struggling artisan or the generous confidant. Their words were never just about price. They were about crafting a shared story where both could emerge feeling victorious, one with a full purse and the other with a prized possession and their dignity intact. This intricate verbal dance raises a final, deeper question. What happened when all the tricks and scripts failed, when a deal collapsed into accusation and the fragile trust of the marketplace shattered completely? A merchant's carefully crafted performance meant nothing when the emperor's word became law. The chaotic freedom of the Roman market collided with the cold, hard reality of imperial edicts, most famously under Emperor Diocletian. His edict on maximum prices was a desperate attempt to curb the empire's rampant inflation, a sprawling stone inscription that listed the highest allowable price for over 1,000 goods and services, from a single lettuce to the wage of a school teacher. Overnight, the public haggling that defined the forum was officially outlawed. A seller could no longer name his own per diem for a pound of British wool or a gallon of Spanish wine. The price was now fixed, chiseled in stone for all to see. This was not a suggestion, it was a command from the throne, enforced by the threat of severe punishment. The ancient art of the deal was in an instant rendered illegal, but the human instinct to trade and profit cannot be so easily erased by decree. It simply goes underground. The moment the edict was announced, a shadow economy was born. A merchant, unable to charge more for his fine Egyptian linen, might simply declare it was out of stock. He would then direct a trusted customer to a back room or arrange a meeting after dark where the real negotiation could take place, free from the prying eyes of imperial officials. The price on the scroll in that back room bore no relation to the one on the public monument. This was the birth of the Roman black market, a world of whispers and winks where the true value of goods was rediscovered in secret. For more common goods, sellers found ingenious ways to circumvent the law without breaking it outright. A baker forced to sell his loaves at a fixed price might suddenly start producing smaller, lighter loaves. The price was legal, but you were getting less bread for your coin. A wine seller could not raise his price per amphora, so he began diluting his product with water or cheap vinegar, effectively charging more for a lower quality. The most creative circumvention involved hidden fees and bundled services. A carpenter, for example, was forbidden from charging more for his labor, but he could legally charge a separate, exorbitant fee for the delivery and installation of a piece of furniture, a service that was suddenly not optional. The negotiation shifted from the price of the goods themselves to the cost of these newly invented ancillary services. The edict did not eliminate haggling, it simply forced it to evolve into a more subtle, more dangerous game. The risk was no longer just a bad deal, but a confrontation with the law. So the next time you walk through a modern market, remember that the invisible hand of commerce has always found a way, even when the heavy hand of empire tries to hold it still. The purchase of a human being was the ultimate test of a Roman negotiator's skill, a transaction where every tactic we have explored was amplified to a terrifying degree. You would not find slaves displayed openly in the main forum. This business was conducted in specialized markets, places with a grim and somber atmosphere far removed from the lively chaos of the food stalls. The slave standing on a raised platform was subjected to an inspection more thorough than any given to a horse or a piece of furniture. The buyer, or more often his agent, would approach with a cold, analytical eye. They would examine the slave's teeth for signs of age or disease, feel the muscles of their arms and legs for strength, and inspect their back for the telltale scars of a disobedient spirit. This was not mere haggling, it was an assessment of raw utility, a calculation of a living asset's potential return. The merchant, in turn, was a master of framing this human commodity. He would not simply state a price, he would launch into a carefully rehearsed narrative, a story designed to inflate the per diem. This one was captured in a war against the fierce Germanic tribes, he might say, implying a hardy constitution. He has been trained as a scribe in a wealthy household, he would claim, attaching a premium for education and skill. Every aspect of the slave's past and potential was a variable in the price negotiation. The buyer's counteroffer was a brutal deconstruction of this story. He might point to a slight limp, questioning the man's value as a laborer. He would challenge the claim of literacy, demanding a demonstration then and there. He might whisper that he had heard a rumor of this very slave having a rebellious nature, a flaw that could poison an entire household. The merchant would respond with practiced outrage, swearing oaths to the gods about the slave's honest character, while the buyer would remain impassive, his own body language a shield of pure calculation. The emotional plays were the most complex layer. A merchant might appeal to pity, explaining that the young woman on the platform was separated from her family and needed a kind master. This was not compassion, it was a sales tactic designed to make the buyer feel like a rescuer rather than a purchaser, loosening his grip on his purse strings. The entire process was a chilling exercise in moral compartmentalization. A Roman saw no contradiction in using the same warm, relational bargaining techniques he used for wine to acquire a person. The final handshake that sealed the deal was a transfer of a human life, all governed by the same unwritten rulebook of offers, counter-offers, and psychological pressure that defined every other market transaction. In this most fraught of negotiations, the true cost was a number that could never truly be measured in sestertii. The true test of a Roman shopper's skill was not in the food market, but in the silent, high-stakes arena of the cloth hall. Here, the purchase of a new toga or tunic was a protracted battle of wits, where every thread and fold was a point of contention. Your first move was never about price, it was a slow, deliberate assessment of the fabric itself. You would run the wool between your fingers, feeling for the soft, tight weave that promised durability and comfort, a sign it came from the prized herds of Tarentum. A coarse, loose weave suggested a cheaper, inferior origin, and your fingers would pause, communicating your skepticism to the merchant without a single word. The color was your next weapon. A rich, deep crimson from the murex shellfish was a mark of immense status, but the merchant's claim of purity was always suspect. You would hold the cloth to the sunlight, searching for the uneven blotches or a dullness that betrayed a cheap overdye with madder root. Pointing out this flaw immediately devalued his most expensive item, grounding his lofty claims in a tangible defect. The negotiation then shifted to the tailor's workmanship. You would turn the garment inside out, your eyes tracing the seams. A single, slightly crooked stitch, a loose thread, these were not minor imperfections, they were leverage. You would sigh, explaining that your own trusted tailor would have to spend hours correcting this sloppy work, a cost that must be reflected in your final offer. The merchant in turn had his own defenses. He might summon the dyer himself, a man with stained fingers, to swear an oath that the color was true. He would drape the toga over your shoulders, adjusting the folds with a practiced hand to show how it would accentuate your stature in the forum, selling you a vision of your future self rather than just a length of cloth. He knew he was not just haggling over wool and dye, he was negotiating for your public identity. The final price agreed upon was a complex calculation of material, craftsmanship, and perceived social advantage, a number that determined how the world would see you long after you had left his stall. The final nod of agreement was more than a signal, it was the start of a sacred ritual. The buyer and seller would extend their right hands, clasping each other's forearms in a gesture known as the dextrum iunctio. This was no casual handshake, it was a physical bond, a tangible representation of the trust now forged between them. In that moment, their honor was literally in each other's grip. The deal was now socially sealed, witnessed by the gods of the marketplace and any bystanders who had watched the long negotiation unfold. But the physical bond was only the beginning. To break this new pact was to violate a profound social contract, and so both parties invoked a final mutual insurance policy. They would call upon the gods to witness their agreement, and then they would utter curses against the one who would break it. A seller might declare that Mercury, the god of commerce, should strip all future profit from any man who tried to back out of this sale. A buyer could invoke Jupiter himself, asking that the thunderer strike down any merchant who delivered inferior goods than what was promised. These were not empty words spat in anger. They were formal, deliberate pronouncements meant to cement the deal in the spiritual realm. The curses served as a powerful deterrent, a supernatural enforcement mechanism in a world without written contracts for everyday purchases. The fear of divine retribution, of a blighted business or a withered harvest, was often a stronger guarantee than any legal threat. This final act transformed a simple market transaction into a solemn covenant. The price was paid, the goods changed hands, and both buyer and seller walked away bound not just by a handshake, but by the chilling echo of their own curses, a reminder that in the Roman world, every deal was made under the watchful eyes of heaven. The curses that sealed a Roman deal echo through the bustling bazaars of Istanbul and the sun-bleached flea markets of Marrakech. The same psychological warfare waged over silk and spices in the Forum is alive and well in the modern negotiation over a hand-woven rug. A merchant in a crowded souk still begins with a pratim, an anchor price so inflated it feels like a test of your sanity. He watches your eyes as he names it, gauging your reaction just as his Roman ancestor did, searching for that flicker of desire that tells him you are already emotionally invested. Your counteroffer, delivered with a dismissive shake of the head, is the contra pratim, a deliberate attempt to reframe his treasure as a common trinket. The entire dance of offer and counteroffer, of feigned disinterest and theatrical despair, is a direct inheritance from those ancient market stalls. Even the modern car dealership operates on these age-old principles. The salesperson does not simply state the price of the vehicle. He first guides you through a carefully orchestrated experience, letting you feel the smooth leather of the steering wheel and imagine the freedom of the open road. He is selling you a story, just as the Roman merchant sold the legend of a gladiator's cloak. When you finally sit down to talk numbers, the initial figure presented is rarely the real one. It is a pratim designed to be haggled down, making you feel victorious when you agree to a sum he was prepared to accept all along. The strategic walkaway remains the buyer's ultimate weapon. Stating your final offer and calmly heading for the door still has the power to magically summon a better deal from a suddenly flexible manager. The silent language of the body is just as critical today. A seasoned negotiator at a flea market knows to keep their posture relaxed and their hands away from the vintage lamp they desperately want, leaning in, holding the object too tightly. These are the modern equivalents of the eager lean that betrayed a Roman buyer 2,000 years ago. And the appeal to personal connection is a universal constant. A seller might notice your accent and suddenly discover a shared hometown, creating that same unspoken bond of faux familiarity that makes a low offer feel like a personal betrayal. The core human instincts that the Romans mastered, pride, greed, the fear of loss, and the desire for a good story, are the same levers pulled in any negotiation, ancient or modern. We did not invent the art of the deal, we simply inherited a rulebook written in the dust of the Roman Forum. These ancient tactics form a complete psychological toolkit, a mental armor for navigating the chaotic Roman market. You learn to read the silent language of the body, where a relaxed posture signaled patience and a fleeting glance could betray desperate desire. You discover the power of the strategic walkaway, a performance of pure indifference that revealed a merchant's true lowest price. Information became your currency, with market reconnaissance and whispered gossip disarming a seller's inflated claims before you even spoke. You saw how emotional appeals and flattery wove a web of faux familiarity, making a low offer feel like a personal betrayal. And you understood the finality of the handshake and the curse, the spiritual and social bonds that sealed every deal under the watchful eyes of the gods. These were not random tricks, but a sophisticated system of human interaction. They revealed the Romans as more than just legendary soldiers and brilliant engineers. They were masters of everyday psychology, navigating a world where every social exchange was a subtle, high-stakes negotiation. Their true genius lay in understanding the human heart, in all its pride, greed, and need for connection. So the next time you find yourself in any kind of negotiation, remember the echoes of the Forum. What ancient tactic might you unconsciously be using? Share your own modern haggling stories in the comments below, and subscribe to keep unraveling the hidden mysteries of daily life in ancient Rome.